forward to future discussions in the future.
The honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the topic I'm discussing tonight comes from a question that I asked here back in the House back in April. And the question was essentially, how can the government square its approval of the Trans Mountain Pipeline with Canada's Paris climate action commitments? And I asked this question then because I hear it almost every day from my constituents. We hear a lot in this place about pipelines and concerns about consultation with First Nations and concerns around the impacts on marine environment, and those are important issues. Those are, in fact, the issues that the Federal Court of Appeal raised when they recently quashed the Trans Mountain expansion approvals. But the question of how a government that claims to be a world leader in climate action can give approval to a pipeline whose only purpose is to expand oil sands production is troubling. And this question was raised by the government's own ministerial panel that toured the pipeline route before the government gave the project approval. This is, in fact, one of the 6 questions that the panel said should have been answered before the pipeline decision was made. And now we've not only approved the pipeline, we've bought it. So how are we doing on our Paris targets? At Paris, we committed to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions by 30% below 2005 levels by 2030, which points to a target of just over 500 megatons of carbon dioxide. We're at about 700 megatons now, so we've got quite a ways to go. To put that in perspective, we'd have to take all the passenger vehicles off Canadian roads to get halfway to that target. And lately, our emissions have only been dropping by a few megatons per year. A national price on carbon would get us part of the way there, and I commend the government for its commitment to that action. But all the government's announced policies will still leave us short. The Climate Action Tracker site, which covers the commitments of all the countries signed on to Paris, classes Canada's climate action efforts as highly insufficient. And it's easy to get the feeling that we're doing well when we live beside the USA, which is listed as critically insufficient. But we share our highly insufficient grade with some countries many people like to criticize for their carbon footprint, such as China. Most of the developed world, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, Mexico, rank well above us. And one of the countries I often hear held up as a problem on the world climate action scene, India, is actually leading the pack with their policies and accomplishments. With planned policies, Canadian emissions are projected to reach 569 megatons by 2030. To get below this, I hear rumors that Canada will try to change the rules, move the goalposts by relying on carbon sinks in our forests and land use policies without reference to the levels that those sources were providing before our Paris commitment. The Climate Action Tracker site adds, there's no clarity as to how many international credits Canada plans to use to meet its target. The use of international carbon credits implies that a portion of Canada's emission reductions will not be met by domestic mitigation efforts. And I'll add here that there's no indication that the international community will recognize international carbon credits for any country trying to meet its Paris commitments. After I first raised this question last spring, the Canadian government doubled down on Trans Mountain and bought the project for $4.5 billion. Mr. Speaker, we're spending our money subsidizing the fossil fuel industry. We're going in the wrong direction.
Parliament Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I can think of no better way to conclude the sitting of today other than to stand up in this chamber and discuss the work that our government is doing in order to protect our environment while still growing the economy so that Canadians can enjoy their quality of life while protecting it for the next generation. I'd like to first start off by thanking my honourable colleague for his question. I know that it comes from a good place. I share his concerns about environmental protection. I spent a good 10 years of my life working in the environmental field, particularly on the issue of climate change as the director of former Vice President Al Gore's Climate Change Awareness Foundation. And this is an issue that is close to me personally as well. So it's an honor for me to discuss this matter with him. I know that his province, Mr. Speaker, is suffering the devastating effects of climate change and has been for some time while wildfires are raging on. An increased risk of forest fires, as he knows full well, and I agree with him, is but one example of the impacts it's having on our communities. Another being the tornado that just devastated our national capital region here in Ottawa and Gatineau. Mr. Speaker, we know our communities must become more resilient, not only for what lies ahead, but for the changes we are currently seeing in our climate. And to this end, I'm proud to say that our government is taking leadership on climate action at home and abroad. We are taking concrete steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, support clean growth, and build climate-resilient infrastructure. We're among the first countries, Mr. Speaker, to sign and ratify the Paris Agreement, and I'm happy to reassure the member that we are following through on our Paris commitments by implementing a national plan to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 30% below 2005 levels, and by 2030, and build resilience to the impacts of climate change within our community. We have a climate change plan, Mr. Speaker. The Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change has been designed to meet or exceed the Paris Agreement targets. Our plan is the first climate change plan in Canada's history to include collective and individual commitments by federal, provincial, and territorial governments, and to be developed through engagement with national representatives of First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation, the general public, non-governmental organizations, as well as businesses. Our plan has more than 50 concrete measures, including a pan-Canadian approach to pricing carbon pollution, as well as new policies, programs, and regulations to reduce emissions in every sector of the economy. Building resilience to the impacts of climate change, foster clean growth technology solutions, and create good jobs that contribute to a strong economy at the same time. The decision we took on the Trans Mountain Expansion project was based on facts, Mr. Speaker, science-based evidence, and what is in our national interest. Our government approved the Trans Mountain Expansion project following the most rigorous federal regulatory review and consultation on a major project in Canadian history. We approved the project subject to 157 legally binding conditions to protect the environment and ensure that we protect the environment moving forward in the safest and most sustainable way. The Trans Mountain Expansion project is consistent with the Pan-Canadian Framework as well as the Government of Alberta's very own emissions cap on the oil sands. We've built a path for sustained Indigenous engagement through the $64.5 million Indigenous Advisory and Monitoring Committee and are confident in the world-leading environmental standards, ocean and coastline protection under the $1.5 billion Ocean Protections Plan. We've taken an approach to resource development that will grow our economy, Mr. Speaker, and protect the environment from climate change, two of our government's main priorities, which are not mutually exclusive, but are in fact complementary. In short, Mr. Speaker, we've covered a lot of ground since launching the Pan-Canadian Framework, and we are starting to see results. When the policies and programs within the framework are fully implemented, our plan will not only allow Canada to meet its 2030 target in full, but will also position us to set and achieve deeper reductions beyond 2030. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my honourable colleague again for his question.
Member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, I'd like to thank the Parliamentary Secretary for those words. The point is I've seen no analysis out there that shows that we will meet those 2030 targets with the Pan-Canadian Framework. It will fall short. And, you know, after I asked this question in the spring, I traveled to Argentina with the Minister of Natural Resources for the G20 energy meeting. The theme of that meeting was the grand transition to a low-carbon world. The Chinese minister talked of his country's bold action, moving directly from coal-fired plants to renewable energy. The UK minister talked of his country's three-point plan of action, legislated targets, significant investments in clean tech, including $2 billion into electric vehicle infrastructure alone, and a real plan to create good jobs in the clean energy sector. Our Canadian minister talked about buying a pipeline. We can do better. We have to do better. And I call on the government to abandon the Trans Mountain project and invest instead in a clean energy future. Thank you.
I don't believe.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd be very happy to talk about the measures we've taken to reduce pollution and continue the discussion with my honourable colleague. We have brought in a pan-Canadian framework and a price on pollution, and in January it'll be $20 per ton These are only some of the actions we're taking to make sure we can reduce greenhouse gases and meet our obligations under the Paris Accord. Now, I thank my honourable colleague for his questions, and I hope to consult with him in the coming days and in the future in general. The motion to